A glass cup smashed against the wall. Milk dripped slowly down the marble. Mary, the old maid, flinched. She didn't even look up. Her hands shook as she bent to pick up the broken pieces. Jason Cole stood across the room, angry and disgusted. "I said almond milk, not this trash. Are you deaf?" Mary kept her eyes on the floor. "I'm sorry, sir. The shop didn't have any." Jason cut her off with a sharp laugh. "Excuses. That's what poor people are good at, always blaming something else." Mary didn't reply. She had worked in this house for over 20 years. She helped raise him when his mother died. Now she felt like a stranger in the home she once cared for. "Get out of my sight," Jason snapped. "You're ruining my morning." She slowly stood and walked away, her back bent, her eyes wet. Jason dropped into the couch and picked up his phone. "Useless people everywhere," he muttered. "No wonder they stay poor." Just then, Richard Cole, his father, stepped into the room. He had heard everything. "Jason," he said, his voice low. Jason didn't look up. "What?" "You spoke to her like she was nothing." "She is nothing," Jason replied, scrolling through his phone. "Why do you always care so much about these servants? They're lucky we even pay them." Richard's heart sank. "She fed you when you were a child. She sang to you when you had nightmares. And now you throw milk at her like trash." Jason looked at him and smirked. "She should have gotten it right." Richard's voice cracked. "What happened to you?" "I grew up. I saw how the world works. Rich people lead, poor people follow. That's just life." There was a long silence. Then Richard said, quietly, "I wasn't born rich. I built this from nothing. I walked to school barefoot. I sold oranges on the roadside." Jason rolled his eyes. Yeah, the poverty story again. I'm not interested." "This empire," Richard said, stepping closer, "I built it with sweat and pain. And I hoped, no, I prayed you would respect that. But you don't. I don't need to. I'm already at the top. You made sure of that." Richard's eyes filled with tears. "You have everything, but you have no soul." Jason stood up. "You done? I have a party to plan. Try not to cry too much." He walked past his father and slammed the door. Richard stood alone, the room quiet now. The milk was still on the floor. The air felt heavy. He sank into the nearest chair, buried his face in his hands, and whispered, "I've raised a heartless man, and I don't know how to save him." The black Mercedes sped through the crowded streets of the city, music blasting from inside. Behind the wheel was Jason Cole, sunglasses on, gold watch shining, left hand lazily holding the steering wheel. He saw them, poor people walking by the roadside, their clothes dusty, their faces tired. He didn't slow down. A deep puddle lay ahead, rainwater mixed with dirt. Two girls in school uniforms walked past, holding hands. Jason smiled. Splash! Brown water sprayed all over them. They screamed and jumped back, their white socks now stained and dripping. Jason laughed loudly from the driver's seat. "Move out of the way next time, peasants!" he shouted. He didn't look back. At the traffic light, a young boy ran up to his window. He held a tray of plantain chips. "Sir, please buy something. Just 200 naira, the boy said, smiling with hope. Jason rolled the glass down slowly. He didn't buy anything. Instead, he picked up a 500 naira note, waved it in the air, then dropped it on the road just as the light turned green. The boy rushed to grab it. Jason sped off, laughing, nearly knocking the tray out of the boy's hands. "Fool," he muttered, running like a dog for small change. At the office, the workers stood as he entered. "Good morning, Mr. Cole," they greeted. He didn't reply. His driver followed behind him, carrying his bag. He walked straight to his assistant's desk. "Where's my coffee?" he snapped at Daniel, a nervous junior staff member. I'm so sorry, sir. I thought you weren't." "Array, you paid to think or to listen," he shouted, loud enough for everyone to hear. People in the office froze. Daniel bent down quickly to pick up the scattered papers, face red with shame. Jason smirked, pulled out his chair, and dropped into it like a king. Later that afternoon, a cleaner, an old woman named Mrs. Helen, came into his office to wipe the windows. He turned sharply. "Get out." "But, sir, I was told to—" "Get out!" he shouted. "Can't you people clean after hours like rats?"
She quickly backed out, wiping tears from her eyes. Jason leaned back and chuckled. "I swear," he said to no one, "this country is full of beggars and slaves." Later that evening, he parked outside a lounge in Lekki. Valets rushed to open his door. He didn't thank them. "Park it somewhere clean," he said. "I don't want poor fingerprints on my car." Inside, he drank the finest wine, surrounded by women and fake friends. They laughed at his jokes, even when they weren't funny. He told stories about how useless poor people were. They all clapped and cheered. "You think I'll ever suffer?" he asked proudly, lifting his glass. "I was born for this life. Poverty is a disease, and thank God I was vaccinated at birth." Everyone laughed again.
Richard Cole stood by the window of his quiet study, watching the rain fall. The house was silent, too silent. Somewhere in the background, thunder rumbled, slow and deep, like the storm building in his heart. He gripped the edge of the window frame. His hands shook. "I failed him," he whispered. His eyes were heavy, not from lack of sleep, but from years of holding back tears. He had tried. Lord knows he had tried. But no matter how much he poured into his son Jason, it all seemed to flow into a bottomless pit of pride. He saw it clearly now. He had created a monster. Jason wasn't born this way. As a child, he had been full of life, curious, quick to laugh. But when Amelia, Jason's mother, died suddenly from cancer, everything changed. Jason was only 10, and Richard, lost in his own grief, had done the only thing he knew. He gave Jason everything: toys, trips, money, anything that could fill the hole a mother's love had left behind. He didn't discipline him. He didn't say no. He didn't want to see Jason cry again. But in trying to protect his son from pain, he had also protected him from growth. Now that boy was a man, rich, powerful, heartless. And worse, he was next in line to take over the Cole Group, a company Richard had built from scratch with his bare hands, an empire rooted in hard work and people's trust. And Jason would ruin it all. Richard sat down at his desk and opened an old wooden box. Inside were two things: a dusty photograph of Amelia holding Jason as a baby, and a torn letter she had once written. "Richard, don't raise him with gold in his hands and no dust on his feet. Let him know life, not just luxury." He closed the box slowly, his heart pounding. It was time. That night, he called a trusted friend, Mr. James Odu, a retired security officer who had worked with the family for years. Loyal, quiet, wise. "I need your help," Richard said. James arrived the next morning. Together they sat at the breakfast table, while Jason slept upstairs in his silk bedsheets. "I want to send him away," Richard began, "to a place where no one knows him. A place where he'll feel hunger, pain, shame, real life." James raised an eyebrow. "You're serious?" "I'm desperate." He explained the plan. Jason would be stripped of his access to money, phone, and connections. He would be dropped in a poor neighborhood far from the city, a place where no one knew his name, his face, or his wealth. He would be given just enough money to survive the first week. The rest, he would have to earn like every other struggling soul. He would live among the poor for 1 full year. During this time, James and a few others would secretly monitor him. No help, just observation. At the end of the year, Richard would judge not by words, but by change. James sat back, silent for a moment. Then he nodded. "This could break him, Richard." "Or save him," Richard replied. They shook hands. Later that evening, Richard called Jason downstairs. Jason strolled in lazily, yawning, holding a glass of wine. "What now?" he asked, already annoyed. Richard looked him in the eye. "I'm sending you away." The young man laughed. "What are you talking about? You're going to live like the people you hate. You'll have no driver, no mansion, no credit card. Just you and the street." Jason blinked. "You can't be serious." "I am. And if I say no, then you'll never see a kobo of my wealth. Ever." Jason dropped the glass. It shattered. "You've lost your mind," he said. "No, I'm trying to help you find yours."
Later that night, Richard stood in the doorway of Jason's room, watching his son sleep for what could be the last time in that bed. He whispered softly, "I'm not punishing you, son. I'm saving you." And as the rain began to fall again outside, he prayed, for the first time in years, "Let him return, but a better man."
The car pulled over on a dusty, crowded street. Shouting, horns, smoke, and heat filled the air. The buildings were old, cracked, and tired. People moved everywhere, selling, buying, arguing, surviving. Jason Cole stepped out, confused and annoyed. "This can't be it," he said, looking around in disgust. "This isn't a real place." The driver said nothing. He opened the trunk, dropped a black bag at Jason's feet, got back into the car, and drove away. "Wait! Hey!" Jason shouted. "Come back here!" But the car was already gone. Jason stood there, alone. He looked down at the bag. 2 shirts, a toothbrush, and 2,000 naira wrapped in nylon. He looked around again. Nobody cared. People walked past him like he was invisible. He scoffed. "I'm not staying here." He started walking. The sun beat down hard, and his expensive sneakers kicked up dust. His designer shirt clung to his back with sweat. A young boy selling bottled water bumped into him by mistake. "Idiot! Can't you see?" Jason barked. The boy blinked at him. "Sorry, sir," he said quickly, and ran off. Jason stood frozen. No one knew him. No one bowed. No one cared that he was a billionaire's son. He clenched his fists. "They're all animals." By afternoon, his stomach growled, loudly. He stopped by a roadside food stand. A woman was frying yam on a black pan, wiping sweat from her forehead. "How much?" Jason asked. 300 naira, she replied, without looking up. He stared at the plate. 2 slices of yam, oily stew, and a small piece of fish. "This looks disgusting," he muttered. She heard him. "No one is forcing you, sir. If you don't want to eat, move aside and let someone who's hungry buy." Jason flinched. He wasn't used to being spoken to like that. He turned and walked away, still hungry. The heat worsened. He wiped his face with a tissue, nearly tripping over a stone in the road. He stopped a man drinking cold water under a faded umbrella. "Where can I get a hotel around here? Something clean." The man looked up, tired. "Do you see a hotel in a place like this? Try sleeping on a corridor, or ask a shop owner if he can pity you." "Sleep outside?" Jason's eyes widened. "That's your choice," the man said, and returned to his drink. Jason walked off, cursing. His legs hurt, his stomach screamed, his pride was cracking. He saw a bench beside a closed-down tailoring shop and sat down. His back ached. He hadn't walked this much in his entire life. He tried to rest, but a woman selling oranges shouted at him. "Please get off that bench. It's not your seat." Jason stood up in shock. "What is wrong with you people?" "Who exactly are you?" she snapped. He couldn't answer. No one knew. No one cared. As the sky turned orange and the day faded into night, Jason panicked. Shops were closing. Streetlights barely worked. A group of boys smoked near the corner. He walked faster, searching, hoping, but there was nowhere to go. He ended up in a quiet alley behind a shut-down kiosk. It was filthy. The air stank. A rat ran past. Jason dropped his bag and sat on a dusty wooden plank. His stomach twisted in pain. His shirt was soaked in sweat. He looked up at the dark sky, blinking fast. His throat felt tight. This can't be my life," he whispered. A cockroach crawled past his leg. He jumped and nearly screamed. He covered his mouth. Far away, someone laughed. Someone cried. Someone begged. Jason sat in silence. For the first time, he felt helpless. For the first time, he felt alone.
Jason woke up to the sharp bite of mosquitoes on his arms and neck. He had barely slept. The wooden plank behind the kiosk was hard. His back ached. His stomach felt like it was twisting into itself. It was still dark, but the city was already waking up. People sweeping the front of their shops, kettles whistling, the clang of metal pots and shouting bus conductors in the distance. Jason sat up slowly, legs stiff and weak. A passerby stared at him.
Jason turned his face away, ashamed. He hadn't bathed, he hadn't eaten, his mouth was dry. His clothes stuck to his skin, his entire body stank. "I can't do this," he whispered. "This isn't me." But it was, at least for now. By 7 a.m., the streets were alive again. Jason wandered aimlessly, too proud to ask for help, too hungry to pretend he didn't need it. He stood near a small buka, watching people eat. Hot beans and pop, swallow with agusi soup, fried plantain. His stomach growled so loudly a child beside him laughed. Jason's face flushed with anger and shame. He walked away fast, eyes burning. He ended up near a mechanic workshop at the edge of the street. The yard was filled with broken-down cars, tires stacked high, and oil stains everywhere. There, under the shade of a tree, was a young man, about Jason's age, wiping sweat off his forehead as he fixed a car engine. Jason stopped to catch his breath. The man noticed him. "Are you looking for someone?" he asked. Jason shook his head. "You look tired." Jason swallowed hard, choosing his words. "I just need somewhere to rest." The man nodded slowly. "No problem. You can sit on that bench over there." Jason stared at him, unsure. "Just like that?" "Yes. Are you not a human being?" Jason moved slowly to the bench. He dropped his bag, sat down, and let out a deep breath, the first one in 2 days. The man picked up his spanner and returned to his work. After a few minutes, Jason asked, "What's your name?" The man smiled. "Kunle. And you?" Jason hesitated. "Jason." Kunle nodded. "Nice to meet you, Jason." They didn't speak much after that. Jason just watched as Kunle worked, how he moved with skill, patience, and focus. He wasn't rich, but he looked calm, in control, free. He couldn't understand it. Later in the afternoon, Kunle returned from a nearby stand with a bowl of rice and beans. He sat beside Jason and opened it. Then, without a word, he split it in two and handed one part to Jason. Jason blinked. "I didn't ask." "I know," Kunle said, "but I get more joy when I share." Jason took the food slowly, his pride fighting his hunger. But hunger won. He ate in silence, ashamed yet grateful. It wasn't restaurant food. It was slightly cold, the fish bone poked his gum, but to Jason, it tasted like life. When evening came, Kunle stood up. "You got anywhere to sleep?" Jason shook his head. Kunle looked at him for a moment, then pointed to a small shed beside the workshop. "That's my resting corner. Not much, but you can manage it for the night." Jason looked at the space. It had a piece of foam, no pillow, no light. But it was dry and it was safe. He nodded slowly. "Thank you." Kunle smiled. "It's nothing. Everybody needs help sometimes." Jason stood frozen. Nobody had ever said that to him before. Not like that. And for the first time, he believed it.
Jason woke up before sunrise. The hard foam under him felt like a slab of stone. His back ached, his arms sore. Mosquitoes had feasted on him all night. The tiny shed was hot, humid, and smelled like sweat, oil, and rubber. He sat up slowly, rubbing his neck, blinking against the dim light creeping through the wooden cracks. Then it hit him, again. This wasn't a bad dream. This was real. He looked around the small shed. His shirt from yesterday still hung in the corner, greasy and damp. A torn calendar flapped gently on the wall. The floor was stained with oil, and someone's old slippers sat by the door. He closed his eyes and sighed. He missed home. He missed the soft cotton sheets, the cold tiled floors under his bare feet, the scent of brewed coffee from the kitchen, bottled water with ice, smooth jazz playing from hidden ceiling speakers, his mother's framed portrait on the hallway wall. Peace, power, prestige. Now look at him, covered in bites, starving, forgotten, cramped in a place that looked and smelled like a mechanic's rag bin. He muttered under his breath, "Why would you do this to me, Dad? Just because I treated poor people like what they are?" He shook his head, bitter. This is more than punishment. This is hell. By the time the sun was up, Kunle was already at work in the main yard, elbow deep in an engine.
Jason stepped outside, squinting. He had slept in Kunle's shed for 2 nights now. He hadn't even had a proper bath. His body screamed for rest, for food, for respect. A middle-aged woman drove up slowly in a battered old Toyota. She stepped out nervously and pointed at the strange sound the car had been making. Kunle greeted her politely, all smiles. Jason, leaning on a wall, scoffed. That thing should be in a scrapyard, he muttered, loud enough for both of them to hear. The woman paused and looked at him. Jason added, "She's wasting your time. That car belongs in a museum." Her face fell. Kunle turned. "Jason, that's enough." Jason folded his arms. "What? I'm just being honest." Kunle walked over, voice calm but firm. "We all have our struggles. Don't make people feel worse than they already do." Jason didn't answer. Kunle watched him for a moment. "Whatever you're going through, don't take it out on strangers. They have their own pain, too." Jason looked down, his throat tight with a shame he didn't know how to hide. Later, around evening, Kunle brought out 2 plastic plates of rice and pepper sauce. The rice was sticky, and the fish was small and dry, but it smelled like survival. Jason hesitated. "You worked, you eat," Kunle said, handing him a plate. They sat in silence, the sunset painting the dusty yard orange and gold. Jason finally asked, "Why are you helping me?" Kunle shrugged, "Because someone helped me once, and I've never forgotten." Jason stared at the food. His hands were bruised. His shirt clung to his back. But somehow this simple meal felt warmer than most he had eaten in a mansion. After the meal, they sat on a bench, wiping their hands. Kunle turned to him. "So, where are you from?" Jason stiffened. "What's your story, really? You don't look like someone who grew up in a place like this." Jason's stomach twisted. He couldn't say it. Couldn't say, "My father's a billionaire." Couldn't say, "He sent me here to suffer." Instead, he replied softly, "I don't want to talk about it." Kunle nodded slowly. "That's fine. I get it. Sometimes the wounds are still open." Jason looked away, blinking hard. Later that night, Jason lay on the foam staring at the tin roof above. He missed everything. The clean towels, the quiet mornings, the imported drinks, the house that never ran out of light or comfort. He turned to the wall and whispered bitterly, "This life is for animals, not for someone like me." But deep down, a part of him, the quiet part he always ignored, wondered, what if the real animal was who he used to be? Days passed. Jason's soft, pampered hands were now bruised and blistered. He had learned to wake up before sunrise, sweep the dusty front yard of the workshop, fetch water from the nearest borehole, and clean oil-slick tools without flinching. Kunle didn't rush him. He taught him slowly, step by step, how to jack up a car, how to loosen a stubborn bolt with care and precision. "Every job matters," Kunle would say, handing him a wrench. "If a man puts his name on anything, even dirt, he should make it clean enough to be proud of." At first, Jason rolled his eyes, but over time, something in him shifted. Working made his anger smaller. Listening made his pride quieter. During breaks, Kunle shared small bags of roasted groundnuts or half sachets of gari and sugar. But more than food, he shared stories. Stories of betrayal, how a trusted friend once stole his workshop money and left him to sleep on the streets. Stories of loyalty, how a stranger once gave him a place to stay for 6 months, rent-free. Stories of brotherhood, loss, and surviving one bad year after another. Jason never asked questions, but he listened. And for once, he didn't feel the need to talk about himself. One hot afternoon, Jason was helping align tires on a beat-up tricycle when Kunle pointed across the road. "That's Aisha," he said. "She runs a little school under that tree." Jason followed his gaze. A girl in a faded blue blouse and long black skirt stood under a mango tree surrounded by children with chalkboards on their laps. She was drawing letters in the sand and smiling as she asked them to repeat after her. Jason squinted. "She teaches here?" Kunle nodded. "Every day, no pay." "That's a waste of time," Jason laughed dryly. "Teaching kids who'll end up hawking or stealing by next year, that's a waste of time." Kunle's smile faded. "Don't say that." Jason shrugged. "I'm just being honest. You think one lesson will save them?" "She thinks it might, and that's enough for her." "Well, that's her problem. I respect smart people who use their time wisely, not waste it on hopeless cases." Kunle didn't reply. Later that afternoon, Jason walked past the tree on his way to the local shop. Aisha was packing her books into a worn-out bag. One of the younger children beside her looked up and waved. Jason glanced at her, hesitated, then muttered, "Still wasting your time, I see." Aisha didn't look up. She continued folding papers. "You could be somewhere better," Jason added. "You're too pretty to be stuck in this dump." This time Aisha looked at him. Her eyes were calm, but there was a sharpness in her gaze that made Jason shift uncomfortably. "I don't teach for praise," she said quietly, "and I don't quit because it's hard. These children matter, even if the world says they don't." Jason scoffed. "That's noble, but reality doesn't care about noble." She gave a small smile. "Neither do I." Then she turned and walked away. Jason stood there, feeling strangely dismissed. Back at the workshop, Jason tried to forget the exchange, but he couldn't. There was something in her voice, the way she spoke without begging to be heard, the quiet confidence, the refusal to defend herself with insults or noise. She hadn't argued. She hadn't shouted. She just let her actions speak and walked away. That night, Jason lay on his foam staring up at the ceiling again. His arms hurt. His fingers were stiff. But what troubled him more was Aisha's silence. She wasn't like the others he used to mock. She didn't flinch, didn't try to impress, didn't care what he thought. She was teaching for free, in dust, under a tree. And somehow, it felt more powerful than anything he had ever done in a mansion. He closed his eyes, confused. What was happening to him?